This webinar is offered as part of the Taking Student Success to Scale, or TS3 initiative hosted by the National Association of System Heads. TS3 was initiated a couple of years ago to support higher education systems and their campuses in scaling evidence-based practices that support student success with a particular focus on redesigning math pathways, high-impact practices, and data analytics. My name is Jason Lane, and I serve as one of the leads for the TS3 predictive analytics work. I also serve as chair of the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership at SUNY Albany and the executive director of SUNY's Academic and Innovative Leadership Institute. In a previous life, I served as the vice provost for the SUNY system and oversaw much of our data analytics work here. Before we start, I just want to note some of the work that's been undertaken so far by the TS3 network on the TS3 website, and you can find that by Googling either TS3 or Taking Student Success to Scale. You'll find recordings of previous webinars, as well as a draft set of tools that we've developed with the generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Those tools include a document of guiding principles, an implementation framework, and a guided pathway document to help campuses think through moving from data to action. We are also currently working on the development of an open online self-paced course designed to help frontline faculty and staff better understand this thing that we're calling predictive analytics and what their role is in it. And we'll share more on that once it's live. But a fundamental aspect of our work is really helping campuses to build a human capacity to effectively leverage data analytics for student success. What you will also find on the website is a copy of a paper issued by the Reinvention Center titled The Ethical Use of Student Data and Analytics, which really serves as the impetus for today's webinar. And with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our two speakers today. Vanessa Roof is recently appointed as the Assistant Director of Institutional Research for the University of Nebraska Central Administration, having recently moved into a system role. Welcome to the system world. And Vanessa's educational background is in psychology and was a practicing therapist working with at-risk teens and families before coming into higher ed. And I'm sure there's much to be learned from them in understanding higher education. And for the last decade prior to her new work, she worked in the Office of Institutional Research at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Our other speaker today is Laura Jensen. Laura is the Associate Provost and Director of Institutional Research at the Colorado State University. She has over 20 years of professional research experience and previously worked at the University of Colorado and Front Range Community College. Laura is committed to helping the institution better understand issues surrounding student success, program evaluation, assessment, enrollment, and faculty, staff, research, and operations. With that, I'm delighted to welcome Vanessa and Laura to our webinar today.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you very much. This is Vanessa, and I am running the slideshow. So this is the first step to see if we can move forward. Did the slides advance for everyone?
They worked.
Perfect. Well, this is our overview of what we hope to discuss this afternoon. One of the first elements of all of these projects is really defining what are your data sources and how are they going to interact with where you want to go for data ethics, predictive modeling, and all of the other questions that evolve around student success and the questions that are presented to higher ed institutions at this point in time. We also want to talk about the current state of data ethics as it's related to some predictive and learning analytics. We do want to hear any insights and conversations that are going on your institutions so that we can collaborate better and understand where everybody else is at. We're going to share what's going on in Nebraska as well as in Colorado, and hopefully have some time for questions at the end.
I'll start by defining the data sources that we're specifically talking about. The first piece of data that we often look at are demographic data, and many times these come from the application. And I want to make clear that we're looking at demographic data not to necessarily raise our selectivity at our institutions. We're still true to our missions, but by understanding the demographics of our students that are coming in, we're better able to be prepared in the ways that we can support those students once they arrive on campus. We're also talking about data related to academic performance. That might be academic performance coming from high school, but it may also incorporate their academic performance as they're moving through their post-secondary career at your institution. Recently, we've been at Colorado State talking more about in-course behavioral data, and with trends being to online education and hybrid models of education, this is increasingly becoming a point of interest for many institutions. And the in-course behavioral data are a little bit tricky because we haven't gone through them as finely to look at the quality and the consistency and make sure that what we think we're looking at is really what we're looking at. And that's in large part because this entire realm of predictive analytics and learning analytics especially is relatively new to many institutions, and the national conversation is really in its infancy. And so the in-course behavioral data really exemplifies that. We also have access to campus engagement data. This is largely through self-report or card swipe data. This is also largely what we would consider our co-curricular experiences on campus. Things like undergraduate research participation, participation in leadership activities, participation in specific events that are happening on campus. And we want to be aware of what students are doing with their time outside of the classroom that might be reinforcing the learning that's taking place in the classroom. And we also want to use data, if we can, from high impact practice participation. So those data, again, largely are self-report. It'd be nice if we could figure out ways to have those data flags in our systems of record to be able to pull those data more easily. But that's another piece that we'd really like to understand better. So our students participating in courses that are really providing structured and consistent feedback from their instructors and their peers, and are they participating in writing across the curriculum, or experiences that really engage them in dialogue across difference or with diverse students from other backgrounds. Before I go on, those are the types of data that Vanessa and I were thinking about. Can we have people chime in if they have other data sources or comments about the data that they're using on their campus, and use this time quickly to be able to understand what's happening in other areas and share our best practices there?
So you can enter your responses on the chat function there, and we've already have a response around campus advising.
Campus advising, that's a really good one. And by campus advising, we mean not only which advisor they're using, but the type of advising that they're receiving. And a lot of that, for at least Colorado State, is still in the advising notes. But it would be great if we could in some way quantify the types of advising that are occurring on campus. The supplemental tutoring and supplemental instruction is another great source of data. Thanks, Carlene, for bringing that up. For Colorado State, we've implemented the card swipe system because we weren't great about keeping track of student sign-ins. So we're trying to do that now in a more consistent way. The National Student Clearinghouse data, that is a big piece of what we're looking at in terms of where students are coming from, how many transfer credits they're bringing in, whether it's a 2-year or a 4-year or a private or a public. The student course evaluations, Rick, that's interesting that you bring that up. We have not yet used our student course evaluations in predictive analytics. We have used them in learning analytics and largely in our online courses, but not yet so much in our on-campus courses. Certainly the financial aid data that Melissa brings up is important, and we should have put that on here. Financial aid in terms of expected family contribution can be a very important indicator and correlated with eventual success. What we see at Colorado State is that we are shaping our financial aid policies in some ways based on retention of specific EFC groups. So that's an important piece of data that we look at. Juliana, the social media postings, That is really interesting, and I have to be honest that we have not started in on that. If you have some information about how you're doing that you could share out in the comment, that would be great. The dining and library usage, certainly with our card swipe data, we have availability to that. Usage of the recreation facilities in the same way. And there are national studies that are showing that use of the rec facilities are associated with increased retention and persistence, perhaps an indicator of the quality of life on campus. And the success indicators based on a particular course grade, certainly we're looking at academic performance not only as they enter into our institutions, but also as they're progressing through their program of study. And Maureen has said athletics. We do have an athletics flag that we use, and in some instances, we actually end up pulling out the students in athletics to look at them separately because they are so well supported with their academic support structures in that. The labor and employment data, we do have labor and employment data that we're looking at in terms of outcomes. We have not yet looked at that in terms of beyond work study, whether or not labor and employment demographic data would fit into our predictive or our learning analytics. And Juliana's saying they have not yet figured out a way to use the social media. If anyone has insights on how to use the social media or references that we might all be able to share, that would be great if we could provide those out. Okay, Vanessa, if you want to switch to the next slide. So those are the sources of the data. The current state of the data ethics, largely, you can see the IRB research, and that's handled by our institutional review boards. And there's strict oversight through Title 45, Part 46 of the CFR, and that is at our institutions very well established. What we're talking about in today's discussion are the data that pertain to everything else. What are we doing in terms of everything else that's not governed by strict IRB protocols and research ethics? And it fits largely into how we think about assessment versus IRB protocol research, and how there is not a current hard line on the ethics that we're going to be using with these data. And as I said, the discussion is really in its infancy. It does have its foundation, though, in the IRB. And so the Belmont Report from 1978 summarizes the ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. And it's the foundational reference for our IRBs, and really is foundational as we think about the ethical implications of data in the use of predictive analytics, learning analytics, and assessment on our campus. So the three tenets of that are that we have respect for persons, protecting their autonomy, that if individuals are able to make their own decisions, that we have informed consent and they're able to read through that and carefully understand it, that we have special protections for subjects that are not able to fully understand a consent form, that we act with the philosophy of do no harm while maximizing benefits for the research project, and that we're also ensuring that we're not exploiting the human subjects, that our procedures are well considered, that they're administered fairly and equally across all populations of subjects. So that's the foundation still, even though that's in the IRB realm, that's still the foundation for where we move forward. We also have the Federal Trade Commission's Fair Information Practice Principles. That is the result of an inquiry into how entities collect and use personal information, and the safeguards that we take to assure that our practices are fair and that we're providing adequate protection. In the beginning, this commission had 4 safeguards: that there would be no personal data record-keeping systems whose existence was secret, that individuals would be able to find out what their information was on record and how it was used, that we would prevent information from being leaked out and made available for purposes beyond the consent of those that were involved, and that we had a way to correct or amend the record so that we could ensure the accuracy of it. As we moved forward with the FIPS, there are 4 tenets to provide adequate privacy. The first is notice, and that goes back to what I was just saying from the original discussions, that consumers should be given the notice of an entity's information practices. And with this in higher education, this is that our students and the parents involved and all of our constituents should be given notice of our intent to collect data, generally how the data is collected, and be given the opportunity to review that protocol. In some ways, that can be matched into the FERPA review that occurs annually by students, and that's how many institutions have chosen to do that. FIPS also requires choice, that students be able to either opt in or opt out of information that's gathered so that they have a sense of control about how their data is used. Many institutions struggle with this because, for instance, data that's collected through your LMS is collected on everyone. And so the opt-in and opt-out may be more a question of not whether or not it's collected at all, because that may be difficult to do in for example, the LMS, but whether or not the data is used. So those are ongoing discussions on campuses. Access, again, referring to the student's ability to review the data that's collected, to verify its contents, to make sure that we have a way to keep it accurate. The security, that we are constantly thinking, especially in today's world, about cybersecurity and penetration of our own firewalls to make sure that our data is secure, that we have access that is dependent on role at the institution, that we deliver just the amount of data that a requester needs on campus, that we provide anonymity when possible, and that we have some way to enforce these measures where there are security guidelines and policies on campus that can be referred to and can be the basis for action if some needs to be taken. Okay, Vanessa, can you forward that? I'll turn it over to Vanessa to talk about what the Reinvention Collaborative conversation has looked like. And again, that conversation was largely based on the 2 reports that I've just mentioned.
So the Reinvention Center Collaborative is a consortium of 67 of the nation's research universities. In 2015, there was the establishment of the Student Success and Learning Analytics Specialized Network, which Laura and I co-chair. And we were interested in finding out what other institutions were doing to tackle this issue of the ethical use of student data, and what was kind of the view for best practices and next steps. What was kind of the overall decision was that the technology was advancing much faster than the policy. So how did we establish what to do next? We sent a survey to all of the institutions that are part of the consortium, and the conclusion of that survey found these 4 guidelines listed below. One is that institutes in higher education should establish some type of a data governance committee that will oversee the data collection, architecture, ethical use, and meaningful reporting of that student data. The second conclusion was that each institution should be fully transparent with the students, the faculty, and the staff about what data is being collected, how it is stored, and how a threat or a data breach is mitigated. Transparency and students understanding what really is going on with all of their data is really key through all of this. And as you talk to students, it's an interesting thing where they often fully expect that you should be using the data that you're collecting on them to help them make decisions. It's almost the Amazon of the times where they want and expect us to use the information we know about them to help them make decisions. But at the same time, they want to know what we're doing with that data and how much are we collecting. And sometimes we found that while students expect us to use that data, they're amazed at how much data we actually have about them. So there's a little disconnect there. A third topic is that institutions in higher ed should use their analytics responsibly in efforts related to the success of individual students, their subpopulations, and within the broader mission. It falls back to that do no harm concept, and how can we use this data to really, really enact what our broader mission is, which is to provide an education and help students reach their goals. And finally, institutions in higher ed have an obligation to share those results from projects with other campuses to inform programs, services, and curriculum. The common theme that happens, I think, in a lot of institutions is everybody's working really, really hard, but not always strategically. That comes from all different realms. Sometimes we're doing a million assessments, but the question is really, what do you do with that data once you collect it? So the follow-up to this is, once you collect all that data, you're really telling students how you're using it and you're studying it. Closing the loop falls back on making some change. How are you using that data to make change? How are you using that data to evaluate programs? How are you using that data to really push the mission forward and make your institution better than it was before? There is another issue that's happening right now that we wanted to put in this presentation just kind of as an additional note. And it's figuring out what to do next with the General Data Protection Regulation. For those that this is perhaps an unknown topic as well, this is the proposal by the European Union that aims to strengthen and unify any data protection within the European Union and address the export of data outside the EU. It's a pretty big policy. It takes effect on May 25th, 2018, and it really holds as the primary data privacy and security regulation for the European Union. Another interesting part of this is it really touches on any personal data that can identify a subject. The subjects apply to any students that come to the United States from European Union countries. It applies to any employees from European Union countries. It applies to our students who study abroad in European Union countries and under certain circumstances within those realms. It applies to research grants from European unions. And it also applies to any donations from alumni who are citizens of European Union countries. So if you can think of all the sensitive data that might pass through any of those circumstances, it's a very big data policy that higher ed institutions in the United States need to think differently and be as involved with this process as possible. What are we supposed to do next? The University of Nebraska Systems legal team is very involved with this, making sure they're in contact with our registrar's offices for the data collection, the admissions offices for data collection, as well as our ITS groups to maintain that the privacy and security is established and up to par with some of these expectations. A caveat of this is that there are penalties for any non-compliance, and they're very, very strict and outlined pretty clearly. We listed a few references at the end of this presentation if you're looking for more information on this, but it's definitely something that's new and on the horizon that also fits into this bigger picture of what to do with student data and policy. So kind of shifting now from some of the issues that are happening on a bigger scale in the history of some of the major landmarks that led up to this point, Laura and I thought we would give some information about what's going on at each of our institutions and then open this up for discussion across the other participants of some of the common issues across our campuses and what we're doing to address those. So first I'll touch on what's happening at the University of Nebraska system, and then we'll go through what's happening in Colorado. Kind of as a global topic right now, I just noticed some of the words moved around on the graphic. The state of Nebraska is in a very significant budget reduction at this moment. And the way this has been addressed is we've established some budget reduction teams to look at policies, procedures, and how to streamline and build efficiencies. One of those budget reduction teams focuses on institutional research and data and policy and how to make changes and work more collaboratively across this whole entire system to think about those issues. If you think of the breadth of students, it's upwards of over 55,000 students. It's a fairly broad reach in terms of how we could be more efficient with using data and policy, and as included with that, some of the tools that are related to everything that touches student data. So about a year ago, we established an institutional research budget reduction team that tried to open the hood on all of these topics and see what we should do. One arm of that is that we established our data governance and oversight team. And this includes members across all the institutions in the Nebraska system, as well as overlap with ITS and representatives from our major data systems for the student information as well as human resources information to really provide the oversight team that would draft some policy and rethink the way the ship should sail with all that's going on with data right now. One caveat of that was establishing the role of a chief data officer. That was something new for the University of Nebraska system, and that was established last summer. That individual reports directly to our provost and is intended to provide oversight in terms of data policy use and maintenance across all the campus systems. As that was happening, at the same point in time, we provided some restructuring between the data sources and reporting units across campuses. As we're streamlining a lot of the groups on campus, one of those being something that's common with quite a few other institutions that have system-wide data issues. I'm thinking of Minnesota is one. University of Maryland's thinking about some of these. I believe Iowa's in on this as well. But moving the IT structure into one IT that functions for the entire system. As this was restructured, we thought differently about the structure for the data warehousing and reporting groups and how their scope really, really needed to broaden in order for this to be successful. And that has created some restructuring that moved our data warehousing team underneath our chief data officer. And the hope with that is to provide more structure and breadth so that the group reporting structures can help support all of these data needs. As these conversations were continuing, data really is the currency of where we're going next, and having that clear data that tells the picture of what's going on and allows for clear evaluation of what's going on between policies and initiatives and campuses really, really is what is necessary for everything to move forward. Another parallel structure that's going on right now is creating some continuity, which really results in culture change. One thing that, as I mentioned before, it happens at our institution, and I imagine others, is that everybody works very, very hard, but not always collaboratively and strategically. We're really trying to take a look under the hood and see how many tools are we using. Data definitions tools, data reporting tools, data visualization tools, and trying to create some continuity between institutions so that we are using kind of the same things most of the time. That helps with data security. There's a real marriage between the academic side of this and the ITS side of it, where making sure that everyone's on the same page and the communication's open so that the security matches the single sign-ons between the institutions and the different places where data resides. And really thinking differently about the data access and the visibility. We've been able to create some real culture change across our campus, where it used to be that data was not even shared within colleges and within the departments within colleges. So being able to open that up, where our College of Arts and Sciences is able to see information across the college as well as between colleges, where Arts and Sciences shares information with engineering in terms of performance metrics, was really a big culture shift for our group. And we were able to move through that, and now we're focusing on common visibility perhaps across the institutions within our system, and creating some common definitions. So while we are one institution, we do have some different business rules across campuses, and we're trying to understand now maybe another level in the weeds in terms of how those data definitions and business rules are the same and different, so that we can have more common reporting metrics through the groups. The final caveat to all of this, though, is really having a clear communication plan. And this is an element I'm very interested to hear how other institutions are approaching this. As we finalize our data governance policy and our data oversight team and the goals of our chief data officer, and we establish those data definitions and the tools and streamlining processes, really publishing and having a clear communication plan will be the other key indicator of all of this, and how we enact these policies and make sure everybody's on the same page and understands where to go to access this information. So as we go through Colorado and then open up for discussion, that's one element I'm very interested in hearing how others are addressing this, is the communication of the plan and how you're integrating across and within your institution to get everybody on board.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share what we're doing at Colorado State. And then, as Vanessa said, I'm also very interested to hear what other folks are doing on their campuses. I'll start with our Data Governance and Architecture Committee. This committee was formed a few years ago with membership at the director level from across various operational areas on our campus. So the registrar sits on it, the director over at CSU Online. We have financial aid, as well as areas of research, advancement, to try to make sure that we're covering all of the administrative data. This committee does not oversee any of the research data or the research protocols, so it's strictly on the administrative side of the house. And this committee talks a lot about some of the things that Vanessa was just mentioning. Are we using common definitions? We are in process of recreating our data structure to make that easier for folks to understand, so that we don't have, I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, but we had 6 GPA variables and you just had to know which one was the one that you needed to be using out of our banner system. So we're trying to clean a lot of that up to make it easier for folks to use. And the point behind that, as it relates to ethics, is that we want to make sure that when folks are gathering data, that they are gathering what they think they are gathering, and that they're not erroneously getting other pieces of data and thereby creating some sort of report or outcomes assessment that is based fundamentally on some erroneous data collection. We're also really working towards transparency efforts on campus, and as our students are signing off on their FERPA rights each year, we're also integrating into that some of the exceptions to FERPA's prohibition against the non-consensual disclosure of the PII, and making sure that they have accurate information about where we're collecting the data. So one of the exceptions is that if organizations are conducting studies, either Colorado State or organizations that we've contracted with are conducting studies on behalf of Colorado State, that we are able under FERPA to provide data to those entities for that specific purpose. And that can be for administering predictive tests, administering student aid programs, or improving instruction. And for us at Colorado State, the predictive analytics and the learning analytics generally fall within that exception. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be fully transparent with students in addition to this, but we want to make sure that they understand the exceptions to FERPA as they're signing off on that each year. It also means that especially in our online and hybrid courses, where there's a lot of data being collected, that the instructors are able to share with students the types of data that are being collected. So for instance, if we're doing a pilot with LoudCloud, or we're doing a pilot with McGraw-Hill to be able to look at which e-text students are really spending their time on, that students are aware that that type of data collection is going on, and that it really is for the use faculty to improve the pedagogical approaches in the classroom and to improve student learning as the end goal. So for example, we had one instructor in her online class who had, I think, 8 different resources that she was providing to students, and an analysis of the in-course behavioral data and correlating that with end course grades revealed that really her top students were using only 3 of those resources and not all 8 of them. And that having all 8 of them might have been actually confusing for students who didn't know, who weren't as experienced or self-regulated in their learning to understand where they should be spending their time. And so they were breaking their time up across all 8 of these resources when really she could have narrowed that down, and in fact did narrow it down. So we have evidence that the learning analytics is really being used to improve the experience that students are having in the classroom. And we want to be able to share that out with students so that they feel more comfortable that the data that we're collecting is indeed for the purposes of helping them as individual students, but also for the purpose of helping the institution become better as a whole. We also have a Learning Analytics Steering Committee. That committee includes representation from CSU Online, from the Institutional Research Office, from our student success initiatives, and also from our IT side of the house. And that committee really sits and talks about which projects are we going to move forward on, how quickly are we going to move forward, what are the issues that we're finding in the data, and ethically, do we have a responsibility to broaden out our approaches, or ethically, when we look at the data, do we feel like we don't understand the data well enough, or the data that we're getting is really dirty and we're not able to use it in an ethical way in order to help students? So that committee has become increasingly focused on the data, the in-course behavioral data, and less focused on the predictive analytics that are based on incoming demographic and admissions factors. We also have discussions ongoing right now about the access to data and the results of studies. In terms of access to data, we are redoing our data warehouse to have specific data marts. And as we're doing that, we're really going to be going through our access and making sure that access is limited to only those individuals on campus that really have a need to know, and that we're providing that access based on roles that we can carefully define and keep current as employees come and go. We have found that our data access before, without it being quite as centralized, there were multiple data authorities that were approving data access, and we just really needed to get a better handle on that in a central way. Very recently, we had our faculty council had a standing committee on teaching and learning, and they produced a really helpful document about the principles of learning analytics. And I wanted to share the highlights of that. It's very similar to the guidelines that have been put out by NASH that I think are available online. The principles of the learning analytics, though, are also really transferable to the use of other administrative data that's outside of the in-course behavioral data. And the ethical principles are intended to just be a foundation for our institutional ethos about how we approach this. They're intended to be congruent with our principles of community that really embrace inclusivity and respect. We believe that these ethical principles should guide us in our selection of learning analytics technologies and tools on campus, that it should be central to that sort of discussion, that it should also, our intervention should be evidence-based with research, and that when we're looking at learning analytics or predictive analytics tools, that we're really thinking about the evidence that it provides. So an example of that in the terms of predictive analytics is we are an EAB school, and we use their campus tool in order to look at predictive analytics for individual students. So it's incumbent upon us to really understand what's the accuracy of their predictive models, what goes into their predictive models, Which data are we providing and which data are they actually using? Does the model change as a student progresses through their career at the institution? We have a responsibility to understand all of that. And if we were to release risk scores to advisors, for instance, that we understand that that risk score has an accuracy level that we are comfortable with, and that our error might be on the side of over intervening with a student instead of not intervening at all. And that's the ethical approach when we think about our predictive analytics. Another example of the ethics with the predictive analytics is understanding how certain admissions factors and student demographics are associated with eventual progression to degree. And I want to stress again that that's an important, it's that those are important data to understand, but not to where, for at least CSU, because we're a land grant institution, not to where we would limit who comes in based on that. We do a holistic review of our applicants, and the students that we bring in, we need to ensure that they have an authentic chance at success. So we need to understand in terms of sheer numbers, the students that we're bringing in that we anticipate will have specific support needs. And so that's the ethical piece of that, and understanding that that we don't tolerate misuse of those data in our admissions processes. We also have in the principles of learning analytics that learning analytics resources and research efforts should be used with special attention to enhancing educational attainment opportunities, especially for those most vulnerable within our community. So again, this goes back to looking at specific subgroups of population, of our student population, where we know they may be at risk for attrition and that we'd like to be able to intervene with. That our student success initiatives and the research that has gone into that inform our learning analytics and the use of our predictive analytics. We have the idea that if we are intervening with an entire class of students, that the intervention will raise the performance of the entire class, but also differentially raise it for those students that are most at risk for attrition. And that's the piece that we want to keep in mind, is that any intervention that we would do with our learning analytics, because of our learning analytics or our predictive analytics, that we're really focused on student success as the bottom line of our reason for doing that. And lastly, the incorporation of best practices, and that's where I want to hear what other institutions are doing. We have learned a lot from being involved in the national conversations that are related to learning analytics and predictive analytics. We've learned a lot from the Reinvention Center institutions, and I'm interested to hear what other folks are doing and if they've tackled any of these issues in what they feel is a successful way for their institution.
And with that, it opens up our next slide, which is the doorway to what are your campus conversations and activities related to data ethics. And I believe we're using the chat for this, so maybe I can't see it, but maybe Jason, you could help us with some of the comments that are coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to type their responses to this question, what activities are you undergoing with related data analytics into the chat function? Happy to help moderate that, or if you have other questions for the panelists as well. We've got about 15 minutes left. So a question.
So cricket is never good.
Well, I have a question for you while folks are thinking here, and that is, a lot of the policies you reviewed early on really predate the technological era, except for, I think, the European approach to this right now, which is now coming online. Do you have any sense of any discussion in the U.S. about states or the federal government thinking about updating or engaging in some new policies related to data and ethics and their use in this technological era?
So certainly there are discussions going on between states and at the federal government in terms of unit record data. And it's the ethical component of that that is the sticking point, of course. So two examples of that. One pertains to wage and employment data. There's a big push that wage and employment rates are a very critical indicator of success from post-secondary education. And currently, there is no clean way to get data across state lines. So when CSU can provide data on our students that stay in Colorado after graduation through our own Department of Labor and Employment, we cannot yet provide the same information across for our graduates that leave the state and are employed elsewhere. It's very difficult. There are some data consortiums and MOUs that can be arranged, but in terms of a national database, we'd really be looking at the Social Security database, which is what's used in our gainful employment reporting. If institutions are familiar with that, any programs that claim a vocational bend, they need to be reported under gainful employment. And those data, when the unit record data are provided, they're matched against the Social Security database. So it would be some kind of similar process to that when we're talking about wage and employment data across the nation. That's really has a lot of ethical issues to it. The same as connecting K through 12 with our post-secondary education. Some states are better at that than others, and then connecting all three of those, knowing that an individual could be tracked from the time they're entering kindergarten clear through all of their employment. And of course, there are lots of reporting advantages to that, but there are a lot of sticking points that need to be worked through, and I think that's the big hesitation with it. There's also issues, in looking at data, again, across state lines, but looking at performance data from one institution to another institution. So, for example, we might look at, if you have a large feeder community college that sends a lot of students to the four-year university, how are those students performing once they get here? And even that has data ethical implications. Again, because the student hasn't been informed that their data would be used for that. It is covered under the FERPA exclusion, but usually that requires the brokering of an MOU between the two institutions to ensure that the data is safeguarded and that it's not used inappropriately.
One of the exceptions to that, or at least one way that we might be able to get around, in a system environment, there are sometimes opportunities to be able to share data between institutions that those not in systems also don't have. So I just throw that out there for people in system offices or campuses within systems, that there are ways to share data among campuses that are not, that may be opportunities different from what individual campuses might have not within systems.
Absolutely,
well.
And there are other consortiums. Unizin is one example where the goal is eventually to be able to upload institutional data to a central data repository with common definitions to be able to better understand on a much larger scale those activities that impact student learning. So there are ways to get around it, but right now it's pretty arduous.
That's true. So we have a question from Rick, and he asks, have you had any pushback from any student groups about using or not using data that has been collected and analyzed?
Vanessa, I'll let you answer that. On our campus, we have not had a lot of feedback, negative feedback from student organizations, and they are involved in hearing about the types of predictive analytics that we're doing with the EAB tool. They're involved in hearing about the data that's collected in our online courses. We haven't heard anything negative. In large part, it's been what Vanessa has said, which is, okay, if you're collecting these data, and I assume you are because I have a student ID card or I've signed in, I've registered for courses, and they understand that there's a central student information system, they assume that we are collecting data. What they want to hear is how we're using it to benefit them. but I'll let Vanessa also address what's going on her campus.
And while Vanessa responds, if anybody else has comments they want to share, feel free to do so in the comment box.
I'd support exactly what Laura said. Our students seem to have an expectation that we utilize the data that's being collected on them. I am not sure that they have a full grasp of the extent and how much data is collected on them. I think what we're trying to do is work through the student government and have that as an able student body to kind of begin some of these discussions. I was thinking of a direct example though. We implemented a card swipe system, I don't know, probably 3 years ago. We wrote an application and it pairs up with our directory information and overnight processes the information in our student information system so that we can track students that are using our tutoring centers or also attending any events that would generally promote student success. So we've used that for quite a few activities. Some of them are broader initiatives and some of them are just very simply, I'm thinking of our graduate student orientations. They needed to send a list back to each of the departments in terms of which of their grad students attended orientation, and they needed to turn a list into the caterer. So that in some instances, it's a very functional use, but in other instances, for example, our Math Resource Center, we want to know who's attending that and if it's making an impact. Likewise to that, I attended some of these events recently just to see kind of how the traffic works with the swipe system and how it all went. And it was really kind of amazing to me that students had no problems with just beeping in. They thought it was just part of the activity. It's, oh yeah, get your card out, you have to beep in. And if you forget it, don't worry, you can just type it in. And they were completely comfortable with it. So, I mean, I was kind of, I don't know if amazed is the right word, but it was really kind of fun to watch and see how everybody thought that was just what you did. And so I think we're at a pretty crucial moment with this whole process because there is so much data collected. We had an initiative we were trying to figure out in terms of seeing how much time students spend on campus. They have to register all their devices. So we have that data that says how long they're connected. So their cell phone and their laptop of how much time they're spending on campus, and does that make an impact, and does it make an impact by class level and by major, and are there any other caveats? And there's just is a lot of data and there's a lot of questions, and we're being held to different standards than we were even 5 or 10 years ago in terms of knowing exactly what's going on and what's going on with who in terms of what helps success. So I think we're at a pretty opportune time to make sure we do it well, because students will be answering questions if it's not published and really transparent.
And how are institutions handling the EU legislation? I'll wait for people to type in their response. It might be a long one.
Another question has come up while people are thinking about that is, Donna asked about, on our campus, the current conversations are focused on appropriateness of allowing everyone to examine course level, grade, and student success rates without identifying the names of the students, but identifying faculty names. And there's fear of this data now being used punitively or as part of faculty promotion and tenure discussions. Have you had any thoughts on that or engagements about that?
So Donna, we at Colorado State, the fear is real, and we do publish those data. You have to have an EID, your credentials, to be able to log into those data. We do not provide them with faculty name, but we do provide them with section ID and the term. So the faculty themselves know who they are when they look at that, and most probably the department heads do also. We believe that access to those data is really important for department heads and faculty also to be able to see the variation within a course, but across different sections of the same course. And we have found in terms of student success that there are some changes that we were able to make, leveraging the strengths of particular faculty in particular sections, whether that's based on the time of day or the term that it's offered in, to really be able to raise those success rates. And by raise the success rates and the grades, I don't mean artificially. I mean that raising them to where we're also tracking, okay, in the next course in that series, how are they performing? And they're performing just as well as students that are taking that course when they took the entering course in a different time of day or a different semester. So we know that the increase in the student success is real and not an artificial increase to get rid of what we were seeing in that report. It's also really important to understand if there are differences across courses based entirely on the instructor. And that information is something else that we can see through, that we can at least see the beginnings of that through looking at it at the section level. And then the contextual conversation, the more qualitative conversation occurs between the department head or the dean and that particular faculty member. And those are important conversations to have. And we do disaggregate it by specific subpopulations, because one of our main goals on campus right now is to close our attainment gaps. So without looking at that, we have no chance of doing it.
So
and
we're coming.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we're coming to the end of our hour, so I wanted to allow time if you all wanted to make any concluding statements about the presentation or the comments today with folks.
I'm glad to see Melissa's comment about how I believe this is related to the students, that the students are involved in the conversations about the types of analytics that they're collecting on campus and the data that the students have had really no concerns about what's being collected. That really is the consensus on the campuses that I've heard from outside of Colorado State also.
Great. Vanessa, anything you want to add?
I'm scrolling through some of the comments, and this is exciting to hear. Some of the questions are the same, and my hope is that everybody continues to collaborate and share where they're at, and also some documentation and best practices, because the more collaborative we are in this effort, I think it will help everyone in the long run.
Absolutely agree, and I think we could have done this for another hour. I want to respect people's time for joining us today. And obviously, this is a conversation that needs to continue. And the fact that no one's responded on your EU question, I think, indicates that not much is being done right now in this space. We could probably have a whole webinar just on that and the implications for it, because I don't hear much of that conversation going on in higher ed right now.
Right, and I'm disappointed. I wanted to be able to just steal some best practices and apply them here and have it work.
I was hoping to also. Well, yeah. Vanessa and Laura, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time and the effort you put into writing the paper and preparing this presentation and sharing your wisdom with us. It's been beneficial, and I think we've raised probably more questions than we provided answers, but these are such critical questions that we all need to be thinking with and grappling with as we move into this new data analytics era. And thank you to those of you who are with us on the webinar today. We really appreciate your engagement in this. I just want to note we have 2 more webinars scheduled coming up that you're invited to. The first is on March 8th at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and that's going to be data for effective scaling. And then on May 5th, there is another webinar which is going to be looking specifically at guided pathways, and I'm sure that information is all available on the NASH TS3 website. So again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your engagement and look forward to having you at a future webinar. And again, my thanks to Laura and Vanessa. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.